The year 553 AD found the Roman Empire at a crossroads, where the shimmering gold of the Byzantine court met the austere, unyielding iron of theological conviction. While Emperor Justinian first sought to rebuild the physical glory of Rome through marble and conquest, he realized that a fractured soul could not support a restored body. The Fifth Ecumenical Council was not merely a meeting of clerics. It was a high-stakes surgical operation intended to stitch together a world torn apart by a single word, a single nature, and a single desperate hope for unity. The Second Council of Constantinople remains one of the most complex and strategically pivotal chapters in the history of Christian dogma. Often overshadowed by the dramatic definitions of Nicaea or the Christological clarity of Chalcedon, the Fifth Ecumenical Council serves as the essential bridge that reconciled the high-altitude theology of the early Church with the practical necessity of imperial and ecclesiastical stability. At its core, this gathering was not merely a reaction to heresy, but a profound attempt to synthesize disparate theological traditions into a singular, cohesive identity for the Roman Empire. The council emerged from a landscape fractured by the fallout of the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. While that earlier assembly had sought to define the relationship between the divine and human natures of Christ, it had inadvertently created a linguistic and political schism between the Diophysites, who accepted the two-nature definition, and the Monophysites, who viewed such language as a betrayal of the unity of Christ's person. By the mid-6th century, the very fabric of the Byzantine Empire was fraying along these religious seams. The Fifth Council, therefore, represents a monumental effort by both church and state to provide a definitive interpretation of orthodoxy that could encompass the concerns of both sides without sacrificing the foundational truths of the faith. The impetus for the council did not arise from a vacuum, but was the direct result of the ambitious vision of Emperor Justinian I. Ascending to sole power in 529 AD, Justinian viewed himself not merely as a secular administrator, but as a divinely appointed guardian of the Christian faith. He operated under the conviction that the security and prosperity of the Roman Empire were inextricably linked to the purity and unity of the Church's doctrine. Consequently, religious division was not just a theological nuisance to him. It was a profound threat to the geopolitical integrity of his realm. Justinian's approach to religious governance was characterized by a relentless drive for conformity. The methodology for achieving this unity was often forceful, as evidenced by his actions against pagans, the closure of non-Christian philosophical schools, and the persecution of sects like the Montanists. However, the rift within mainstream Christianity proved more difficult to bridge through decree alone. The emperor realized that to truly stabilize the East, he had to address the grievances of the Monophysite factions in Syria and Egypt, who felt that the Council of Chalcedon had leaned too far toward the Nestorian heresy. The motivation for seeking doctrinal peace led Justinian into a labyrinth of ecclesiastical politics. While his sincerity in desiring a unified church is often acknowledged, his lack of foresight regarding the tenacity of theological tradition sometimes left him vulnerable to the manipulations of court theologians. It was within this atmosphere of high-stakes diplomacy that the three chapters controversy was ignited, serving as the primary catalyst for the eventual assembly in 553. The road to Constantinople's Second was paved with significant tension between the imperial court and the Roman papacy. The convocation of a general council required a delicate balance of power, and Justinian sought at least the veneer of papal cooperation. Pope Vigilius, a figure whose legacy is often defined by his vacillation, initially entered into agreements with the emperor regarding the necessity of a synod to resolve the burgeoning crisis over the three chapters. The historical record indicates that Vigilius met with Justinian, in the presence of Patriarch Menas of Constantinople and other high-ranking civil and religious officials, to discuss the parameters of this future gathering. They agreed that a great synod should be the final arbiter of the controversy, and until such a time, the matter was to remain dormant. However, the reality of the situation was far from harmonious. The emperor eventually proceeded to convoke the council in 553 without the full concurrence or presence of the pope, who had grown increasingly wary of the imperial agenda. When the council finally opened on May 4th, 553, the demographics of the assembly reflected the deep-seated divisions between the East and the West. The gathering was dominated by Eastern prelates, with 165 bishops in total attendance. The scarcity of Western representation was stark. Only 5 bishops from Africa were present to represent the Latin-speaking world, highlighting the growing cultural and theological distance between Rome and Constantinople. The sessions were presided over by Eutychius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who occupied the chair of leadership throughout the 8 sessions. Other prominent figures included Apollinaris of Alexandria and Domnus of Antioch, as well as deputies representing the Patriarch of Jerusalem. This leadership structure ensured that the council would be conducted primarily through the lens of Eastern theological concerns and imperial interests. Despite the absence of Pope Vigilius, who refused to attend despite repeated invitations, the council proceeded to claim ecumenical authority, setting the stage for a dramatic showdown between the emperor's will and the independence of the Roman See. Through this convocation, Justinian intended to elevate his imperial edicts to the status of universal church law, hoping to finally silence the dissenting voices that had plagued the empire for over a century. The assembly was not merely a meeting of minds, but a theater of power where the future of Christian orthodoxy was to be negotiated under the watchful eye of the Byzantine throne. The council was not summoned to address a single, isolated problem, but rather to extinguish a series of theological wildfires that threatened to consume the unity of the imperial church. The roots of the assembly lay in a complex interplay of ancient philosophical disputes, recent Christological fractures, and the opportunistic maneuvering of ecclesiastical advisors who sought to direct the emperor's considerable influence. A foundational cause for the assembly's tension involved the lingering influence and eventual condemnation of Origen of Alexandria. Long after his death, the speculations of this prolific scholar concerning the pre-existence of souls and the eventual restoration of all things continued to incite unrest, particularly among monastic communities. The conflict was not merely academic. It represented a clash over the boundaries of orthodox mystery versus speculative philosophy. The Origenist crisis became a strategic tool in the hands of Theodore Asidas, the bishop of Caesarea. In 543, as Justinian intensified his crackdown on Origenist thought, Asidas sought a way to shield his faction from imperial wrath. He ingeniously pivoted the emperor's attention away from Origen and toward the 3 chapters, writings by Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, and Ibas of Edessa. Asidas suggested that by condemning these figures, the emperor could demonstrate his anti-Nestorian credentials so convincingly that the monophysites would find no reason to remain outside the imperial church. This redirection of imperial policy transformed a local monastic dispute into a global ecclesiastical crisis. The primary focus of the council, however, centered on the 3 chapters. These consisted of the person and writings of Theodore of Mopsuestia, a teacher of Nestorius and a seminal figure in what would be deemed Nestorianism. Select works of Theodoret of Cyrus, which had been used to attack the theology of Cyril of Alexandria. The letter of Ibas of Edessa to Maris, which defended Theodore and criticized the Council of Ephesus. The difficulty lay in the fact that the Council of Chalcedon had seemingly cleared Theodoret and Ibas of heresy after they signed a formula of faith. To condemn them now was viewed by many, especially in the West, as a direct assault on the authority of Chalcedon itself. Justinian was essentially asking the Church to perform a retroactive theological purge to satisfy a political goal, the reconciliation of the monophysites, who viewed these 3 authors as the source and bulwark of heresy. Justinian did not wait for the council to begin his campaign against the 3 chapters. In late 543 or early 544, he issued an edict formally condemning them, demanding that every bishop sign the document. This placed the episcopate in a precarious position. To refuse meant the threat of banishment. To sign meant potentially undermining the very council, Chalcedon, that had defined their orthodoxy. The Eastern patriarchs, despite their misgivings about the theological implications, largely capitulated under imperial pressure. Patriarch Menas of Constantinople signed only after asserting that his signature would be void if the Pope did not also concur. The patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem similarly yielded after being threatened with removal from their sees. This forced unanimity in the East only served to sharpen the contrast with the growing resistance in the West. The three chapters debate was the crucible in which the Council's primary theological work was forged. It was a struggle to define how the Church should treat its past and how it should interpret the legacy of its teachers in light of evolving doctrinal clarity. The controversy forced the Council to address a nagging question. Could a council, Chalcedon, be correct in its definitions while being perceived as ambiguous in its treatment of specific individuals? The three authors in question were deeply intertwined with the development of Nestorianism. Theodore of Mopsuestia was widely regarded as the architect of the theological framework that Nestorius later popularized. While Theodore had died in peace with the Church, his writings were later seen as providing the vitality for Nestorianism. Theodoret and Ebus, though they eventually accepted the condemnation of Nestorius, remained figures of intense suspicion for their past defenses of Theodore's system. The Monophysites exploited this historical nuance. They argued that if the Church truly rejected Nestorius, it must also reject the men who taught him and the letters that defended him. By tolerating these figures, the Church, in Monophysite eyes, remained secretly Nestorian. Justinian, recognizing the potency of this argument, sought to remove this pretext for division by striking the three chapters from the record of orthodox thought. The genius and the danger of Justinian's move lay in his attempt to protect Chalcedon while dismantling its previous judgments on these men. In his edict, he famously declared anathema upon anyone who suggested he was trying to set aside the fathers of Chalcedon. He argued that condemning the three chapters was actually a fulfillment of Chalcedon's true intent. However, many bishops, particularly in the West, saw this as an impossible contradiction. To them, Chalcedon had examined these men and found them worthy of restoration. To revisit those cases nearly a century later felt like a betrayal of conciliar finality. This tension between the spirit of Chalcedon, which the emperor claimed to defend, and the letter of Chalcedon, which the Westerners sought to preserve, became the central drama of the era. The controversy was further inflamed by the involvement of Pope Vigilius. Before the council, Vigilius had issued his own condemnation of the chapters in a document known as the Judicatum. This move backfired spectacularly, as he was immediately excommunicated by African bishops, most notably Facundus of Hermiane, who wrote a vigorous defense of the three chapters. This internal Western schism demonstrated that the controversy was no longer just a dispute between East and West, but a profound crisis of authority within the Roman See itself. Justinian's attempt to use the council to correct history and reconcile the Monophysites had instead created a theological minefield. The Fifth Ecumenical Council was thus tasked with navigating a path that would preserve the dignity of Chalcedon, satisfy the demands of the emperor, and somehow bridge the growing chasm between the Latin and Greek worlds. While the emperor's vision for a unified church was clear in his own mind, the implementation of his decrees revealed a deep tectonic rift between the eastern and western reaches of Christendom. This friction was not merely a matter of differing theological opinions, but was a fundamental clash over the nature of ecclesiastical independence and the finality of prior conciliar decisions. The methodology Justinian employed to bridge this gap often relied more on the weight of imperial power than on the gentleness of pastoral persuasion. In the East, the pressure to conform to the imperial edict against the three chapters was immediate and overwhelming. The patriarchs of the great Eastern sees, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, found themselves in a precarious position. They recognized that to condemn the three chapters was to risk undermining the prestige of the Council of Chalcedon. Yet, they also understood that the emperor's patience with dissent was non-existent. Patriarch Menas of Constantinople initially exhibited a measure of resistance, yet he eventually yielded to the imperial will. His signature, however, was conditional. He stipulated that his agreement would remain valid only if the Roman pontiff also lent his approval. This move was a transparent attempt to shield himself behind the authority of the West. The other Eastern patriarchs did not have such luxury. Facing the direct threat of deposition from their sees, they subscribed to the document, and the majority of the Oriental bishops followed their lead. Consequently, the East presented a facade of unity, though it was one built largely on the foundation of imperial compulsion. The situation in the West stood in stark contrast to the swift compliance of the East. The Latin-speaking bishops, particularly those in North Africa and Italy, viewed the emperor's interference in established dogma with profound suspicion. To them, the case against the three chapters had already been settled by the Council of Chalcedon when it restored Theodoret and Ibas to their sees. To revisit these judgments was seen as an assault on the stability of the entire ecclesiastical order. Pope Vigilius, initially supported by his Western colleagues, refused to subscribe to the emperor's condemnatory edict. This refusal was not merely a defense of the three specific authors, but a defense of the principle that a secular ruler could not unilaterally alter the records of an ecumenical council. This resistance created a geopolitical stalemate that Justinian could not ignore if he hoped for his council to be truly ecumenical. Justinian's response to papal resistance was a demonstration of the Caesaro-papism that defined his reign. Realizing that Vigilius would not come to Constantinople of his own volition, the emperor dispatched a detachment of troops to Sicily in November 545 to ensure the pope's invitation was accepted. Vigilius was essentially taken as an imperial prisoner, arriving in the capital in early 547 after more than a year of travel and delay. The Pope's stay in Constantinople was marked by a series of high-pressure negotiations and personal vacillations. Met with imperial pomp, but surrounded by imperial guards, Vigilius struggled to maintain his independence. In 548, he issued the Judicatum, a document that condemned the three chapters while attempting to preserve the authority of Chalcedon. This compromise satisfied no one. It enraged his Western supporters, leading to his excommunication by African bishops, and failed to fully appease the emperor. Vigilius eventually retracted his support, refusing to accept a second imperial edict in 551, which led to a complete breakdown in the relationship between the pope and the emperor. The Fifth Ecumenical Council finally opened on May 4, 553, under a cloud of unresolved tension. The assembly was a peculiar one, a universal gathering where the head of the Roman Church was a mere stone's throw away, yet refused to cross the threshold of the meeting hall. This strategic absence and the subsequent reactions of the Council Fathers defined the dramatic finality of the proceedings. Vigilius had argued for a postponement of the council, hoping for the arrival of more Latin bishops to balance the Eastern-dominated assembly. When his requests were ignored, he chose to boycott the sessions despite being repeatedly and respectfully invited. He intended his absence to be a protest against the council's legitimacy and the imperial pressure under which it was being conducted. In his stead, the council proceeded under the leadership of Patriarch Eutychius. The bishops present were primarily from the East, with only 5 African delegates representing the vast territories of the West. This demographic imbalance meant the council was effectively an echo chamber for the emperor's theological program, yet it operated with the full conviction that it held universal authority over the Church. While the council was in session, Vigilius made a final, desperate attempt to assert his authority. On May 14, 553, he published his Constitutum, a document signed by 16 Western bishops. In it, he took a nuanced middle path. He condemned certain heretical propositions found in the works of Theodore of Mopsuestia, but he strictly forbade the condemnation of Theodore's person or the person and writings of Theodoret and Ibas. The reaction from the council was swift and severe. Acting at the direct suggestion of Justinian, the Synod, in its 7th session, decided that the name of Vigilius should be struck from the diptychs, the official list of those for whom prayers were offered during the liturgy. This was a formal act of breaking communion. The Pope and the Council were now in open, official antagonism. The Assembly had effectively decided that the consensus of the bishops, backed by the Emperor, outweighed the individual dissent of the Bishop of Rome. The Council concluded its work by issuing 14 formal anathemas. These decrees were the technical fulfillment of Justinian's long-held goal. The first 12 anathemas focused primarily on the theology and person of Theodore of Mopsuestia, systematically dismantling the pillars of his Christology. The 13th anathema was directed at Theodoret of Cyrus, specifically targeting his works against Cyril of Alexandria. The 14th anathema condemned the letter of Ebas, which was viewed as a defense of Nestorian ideology. These condemnations were not merely academic. They were designed to be the final, irreversible word on the matter. The Council Fathers asserted that these writings were inconsistent with the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition. By anathematizing these 3 chapters, the Council believed it had finally removed the stumbling block that kept the Monophysites from returning to the Imperial Church, though the political reality would soon prove much more complicated. The conclusion of the Council's 8th session did not immediately signal the end of the crisis. Instead, it inaugurated a period of intense pressure directed toward the captive Pope Vigilius, whose lack of firmness of character became the final instrument of imperial policy. The transition from open antagonism to a fragile reconciliation was achieved through a combination of physical exhaustion, political isolation, and the relentless persistence of Justinian. Following the council's adjournment, Vigilius remained in a state of suspension and exile. However, the landscape shifted when the Roman people and clergy, newly liberated from the Goths by the general Narses, petitioned the emperor for their bishop's return. Justinian seized this opportunity, making the pope's release conditional upon his recognition of the council's decrees. Broken by 7 years of absence and imperial duress, Vigilius finally capitulated. In a letter to Patriarch Eutychius dated December 8, 553, and a subsequent Second Constitutum in February 554, the Pope formally approved the council's work. He characterized the council members, who had previously struck his name from the liturgy, as his brethren and fellow priests, effectively erasing the previous year's excommunications. This reversal meant that the 3 chapters were now officially condemned by the Roman See. The Pope's return to his see was a journey he would never complete. Setting out from Constantinople, he died at Syracuse in 555. His legacy was one of profound vacillation. What he authoritatively pronounced as truth one day, he revoked with equal authority the next, depending on the shifting political winds. Despite his personal failures, his final submission proved historically decisive. By endorsing the council's anathemas, he provided the necessary bridge for the West to eventually accept the council as ecumenical. His successor, Pelagius I, immediately acknowledged the council upon his ascension, reinforcing the new status quo of the Roman Church. While the papacy had been brought into alignment with the imperial will, the broader Western Church was far from pacified. The forced acceptance of the council triggered a series of ecclesiastical revolts that would haunt the West for centuries, highlighting the deep-seated resistance to what was perceived as heretical imperial dictation. The reaction to Pope Pelagius I's acceptance of the council was one of outrage across several Latin provinces. Large portions of the Western Church, particularly in northern Italy, Africa, and Illyria, viewed the condemnation of the 3 chapters as an abandonment of the Council of Chalcedon. They regarded the Pope himself as having fallen into heresy. The most severe fracture occurred in the provinces of Istria and Aquileia. The Patriarch of Aquileia and his subordinate bishops formally seceded from communion with Rome. This schism was not a brief protest. It persisted with remarkable tenacity, remaining unresolved until the end of the 7th century. It was only through the long-term diplomatic efforts of subsequent popes, most notably Gregory the Great, that these regions were slowly brought back into the fold. The status of Constantinople II as a truly ecumenical council was not granted overnight, but was acquired gradually through the weight of papal influence and the passage of time. For many in the West, the council was at first an object of suspicion, its decrees seen as unnecessary or even harmful to the clarity of the faith. In modern times, this ambivalence persists in certain quarters. While the council is fully recognized by the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran traditions, many Protestant thinkers continue to regard the first 4 councils as the definitive boundary of orthodoxy, viewing the events of 553 as a political overreach that added little of value to the Christological foundation. The long-term legacy of the council also includes its role as a case study in the relationship between church and state. It demonstrated that while an emperor could convene an assembly and dictate its initial findings, the ultimate authority of a council relied on its eventual reception by the wider body of the faithful. The three chapters controversy remains a reminder of the inherent danger when political convenience is used to navigate the nuanced waters of divine mystery. The significance of the Second Council of Constantinople extends beyond its political drama, as it served to solidify the linguistic and conceptual framework of Christian orthodoxy. Rather than drafting a novel creed, the assembly focused on a rigorous methodology of verification, emphasizing its absolute adherence to the four preceding ecumenical councils. The Council Fathers sought to demonstrate that the three chapters were fundamentally inconsistent with the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition. The theological legacy of the Council is most visible in its insistence on the unity of Christ's person. In an era when some viewed the Incarnation as a mere indwelling of the divine word in a human man, the Council issued negative decrees to safeguard the reality of the union. It condemned any perspective that regarded the Savior as one person only in name or honor. The most striking affirmation of the Council was its declaration regarding the crucifixion. If anyone does not confess his belief that our Lord Jesus Christ, who was crucified in his human flesh, is truly God and the Lord of glory and one of the members of the Holy Trinity, let him be anathema. This statement was crucial because it extended the logic of Chalcedon from Christ's birth to his death. It clarified that because God the Son was truly born, it was truly God the Son who suffered on the cross in his humanity. Justinian, a fairly skilled theologian in his own right, believed that the rift between pro- and anti-Chalcedonians could be mended by returning to a strong emphasis on the theology of Cyril of Alexandria. The council thus functioned as a legitimate development of earlier doctrine, clarifying the hypostatic union, the duality of Christ being fully God and fully man in one single person. By establishing this precise implication of Chalcedon, the Council provided the Christian world with a necessary defense against heresy, asserting that to deny either the divine or human nature of Jesus is equally erroneous. A persistent point of scholarly contention surrounding the 553 Assembly is the degree to which it addressed the teachings of Origen. While some historical traditions insist that Origen and his speculative system were formally anathematized, many modern authorities remain undecided or offer reservations on the matter. The historical record indicates that the Fifth Ecumenical Council was convoked exclusively to resolve the affair of the three chapters. Neither Origen nor Origenism served as the initial catalyst for the gathering. The official acts of the 8 conciliary sessions deal solely with the three chapters. Furthermore, contemporary records from Popes Vigilius, Pelagius I, Pelagius II, and Gregory the Great mention only the three chapters when discussing the council, suggesting they were unaware of any formal condemnation of Origenism during the synod. The confusion likely stems from events that occurred just prior to the council's formal opening. While the assembly was delayed by the resistance of Pope Vigilius, the bishops already gathered in Constantinople were ordered by the emperor to consider a specific form of Origenism held by certain monastic parties in Palestine. This extraconciliary sentence, a judgment passed outside the formal sessions of the Ecumenical Council, was at a later period mistaken for a decree of the council itself. This distinction is vital for understanding how imperial mandates often blurred the lines of formal ecclesiastical law during Justinian's reign. When evaluating the legacy of the Second Council of Constantinople, one must distinguish between its immediate geopolitical objectives and its lasting dogmatic contributions. The Council stands as a fascinating paradox. It achieved nearly every theological goal it set for itself, yet it failed almost entirely to realize the political peace that the Emperor Justinian so desperately craved. The primary secular motivation for the council was the reconciliation of the monophysites, the non-Chalcedonians, in Egypt and Syria. Justinian believed that by anathematizing the three chapters, thereby purging the Church of the Nestorian elements that the Monophysites loathed. He could create a unified religious front for his empire. This did not happen. The Monophysites remained unconvinced, viewing the council's continued adherence to Chalcedon as an insurmountable barrier. Instead of healing a rift, the council inadvertently created new ones in the West, leading to the aforementioned schisms in Italy and Africa. Theologically, however, the council was far from a failure. It provided a sophisticated synthesis that prevented the Church from drifting into a shallow understanding of Christ. By insisting that one and the same person was both the worker of miracles and the sufferer on the cross, it solidified a Christology that was deeply rooted in the mystery of the Incarnation. It proved that the Church could engage in rigorous self-correction and historical house-cleaning without overturning its foundational creeds. No historical analysis of this council is complete without a focused examination of Pope Vigilius, a figure whose reputation has been scrutinized for centuries. His role in the proceedings was defined by an agonizing struggle between the preservation of papal dignity and the reality of imperial coercion. Vigilius is often characterized by his vacillation, moving from resistance to compromise, then back to resistance, and finally to total submission. This perceived weakness of character, however, must be understood within the context of his circumstances. He was a captive in a foreign capital, surrounded by advisors who were often in the emperor's pocket, and responsible for a Western constituency that was increasingly alienated by his actions. While his inconsistency is undeniable, some historians argue that his struggle represented the growing pains of the papacy as it sought to define its authority in relation to the Byzantine state. His ultimate submission, though tragic from a personal standpoint, served a pragmatic purpose. It allowed the West to accept the Council's findings without having to definitively break with the Eastern Church. Vigilius may not have been a hero of conviction, but he was a pivotal bridge through which the Council's decrees eventually reached the wider Christian world. The ripples of the 553 Assembly continue to be felt in the modern theological landscape. Its lasting influence is not found in the resolution of 6th century political squabbles, but in the institutional and intellectual scaffolding it provided for future generations. Despite its controversial origins and the initial resistance it faced, the Fifth Ecumenical Council is today recognized as fully authoritative by the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran churches. This universal acceptance is a testament to the fact that the Council's theological depth eventually outweighed its political baggage. It served to reaffirm the work of Nicaea, Constantinople first, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, ensuring that the development of doctrine remained a continuous and coherent process. Modern scholarship has moved away from viewing the Council as a mere imperial power grab. Instead, scholars increasingly recognize it as a legitimate and sophisticated development of the Council of Chalcedon. It addressed the what and the who of Jesus Christ with a precision that earlier councils had not yet fully articulated. By synthesizing the perspectives of Cyril of Alexandria with the definitions of Chalcedon, the Council created a robust Christological framework that has informed Christian thought for nearly 1,500 years. Finally, the Council remains a powerful reminder of the complex relationship between secular and ecclesiastical power. It serves as a historical case study on the limits of coercion in matters of faith. While Justinian could force the gathering of bishops and the signing of documents, he could not force the reception of the Council by the hearts of the faithful. The Fifth Ecumenical Council teaches that true doctrinal unity cannot be manufactured through imperial edict. It must be discovered through the shared consensus of the Church as it navigates the mysteries of its own history. The legacy of the Second Council of Constantinople invites us to look beyond the cold dates of history and consider the weight of our own convictions. As we reflect on this chapter of the faith, we are compelled to ask, how do we navigate the tension between the pursuit of unity and the preservation of truth? In our own lives, do we seek the imperial peace of convenience, or are we willing to endure the discomfort of deep theological integrity? The Fifth Ecumenical Council proved that while humans may attempt to orchestrate the movements of the Church for political ends, The Spirit often uses those very moments to forge a more profound understanding of the Savior. Take a moment this week to consider the 3 chapters in your own spiritual journey. Those areas where past misunderstandings or lingering doubts might be hindering your current growth. How might a deeper look at the unity of Christ's person provide the clarity you need? If you found this deep dive into the 6th century church illuminating, do not miss what comes next. We are just beginning to uncover the dramatic evolution of Christian dogma. Subscribe now, Theology Today, to ensure you receive our future long-form narratives directly. Join us next week as we transition from the 2 natures of the 5th Council to the 2 wills of the 6th Ecumenical Council, Constantinople III. We will explore the monothelite controversy, the curious case of Pope Honorius, and the final resolution of the great Christological debates that defined the first millennium. See you next week for the next chapter in the story of the faith.